I'm actually going to turn my camera off now, if that's okay with everyone, just because I don't think you need to see me.
Oh, well, if everyone else has got rid of their cameras, I'll feel self-conscious.
Welcome to the second Escape Pod, the new podcast series from Escape Technology. I'm Jason Jenner. Today we'll be talking about remote workflows, specifically with Autodesk Flame, and the challenges faced by content creation studios with that particular topic. As always, we'll need a little bit of help, so we are joined by my colleagues, Lee Danskin, our CTO, and our senior engineer and flame specialist, Tim Harcourt. And our special guest is Mr. Derek Moore, CEO of Coffee and TV. Derek, good afternoon.
Hi, Jason. Thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
Lovely. Thank you for joining us. I think just to get going, it would be really helpful if you could just give us a sort of a brief history of Coffee and TV, who you guys are, and the type of work and type of projects that you guys take on.
Sure. So we try to be a very high-end visual content creation studio. We started in 2012. Four of us were artists for many years, for playing, with the big guys, and we actually started with a crazy notion that we wouldn't ever need a studio, and we just work remotely and connect to each other via the internet. And like to think we were ahead of our time, but actually we just got it completely wrong. We did start that way, but very quickly we realised we needed to present work to clients, and they wanted to come in and see us and that whole thing. So we ended up taking some studio space in Soho, and that kind of grew, and now we're about 40 people, a few freelancers, got a couple of floors in a nice studio in Broadwick Street, and the working from home thing has come back with a vengeance. So we do high-end projects for broadcasters, for advertisers, for production companies, mainly short-form things, but we dabble in the odd little feature film as well occasionally. A lot of CGI, a lot of animation, a lot of flame work, as you say. So we're kind of at the front line of this kind of thing, I think. And you guys have been a massive help to us in getting us working remotely.
Thank you for that, Derek. So, yeah, how kind of amusing that you were imagining a remote studio at the very outset of the business, and then here we are today, working under precisely those restrictions. Okay, so could you just expand a little bit on Escape's role as a support partner to Coffee and TV? Because obviously we do various bits of work with you guys.
Well, I think we've been working with you since very much from the beginning. What's hard for a startup studio is having access to even being able to afford an engineer is a luxury in sort of bootstrapping times when you're starting a visual effects company. So having you guys to support us as and when we needed, rather than having to employ somebody full time, was massively helpful. And then as we've grown, we thought at some point we would hire our own engineer or an engineering team. But actually that hasn't worked. It's been great to work with you guys in that you've got such a broad range of specializations, more than we would ever get from one or two or three engineers, that it's really helpful to have that specialization on tap that we can call and you'll come and solve whatever our issues are.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. Thank you. That was a shameless plug there, which we'll take that. We'll take that. So talking about obviously this is all moving towards a discussion around remote working. When you've talked about the imagination that you might have a remote studio in the early days, and that didn't come to pass, and you ended up with a more traditional physically based infrastructure. But can we just talk about the recent events? I mean, as the sort of COVID-19 pandemic started to unfold with a vengeance, earlier in the year, how did you see that all? I mean, how quick? Because I think you guys were quite early in recognizing that you would need to change something. I mean, what discussions were going on with you and your partners in the business? How did you see it all?
I think you're right. I think we were the first studio to get fully remote and tell everybody about it, that we could do that. I think we were at just the right size. I'd like to say we were the smartest or ahead of the curve, but actually I think we were just, big enough to be able to have the resources like you guys help us out and not so big that we couldn't really pivot or change the model that quickly. So we were lucky in terms of the size we were at. We were also lucky with some of the technology that we've chosen. All of it has been able to be, off-sited successfully, and that's not been the case with some of our competitors. So really, times like this is, first thing was to do was to keep our staff safe. So we reacted really quickly to make sure that people weren't on public transport and were able to stay at home and connect interactively. We've always had the other big part of this, I think, is the culture. We've always had a very big emphasis on trust and letting people be who they want to be internally, our staff. So we trust them. If they want to work from home, we've always been able to work from home, like 1 or 2 or 3 people at a time. The only change now is that everybody suddenly had to do it together at the same time. So the technology and the systems and the processes of communication particularly, but also connectivity have always been there, with the exception of remote Flame, as we'll talk about later, I'm sure. But the mindset was always there. So it was very easy for us to turn the switch and say, right now, tomorrow, or in fact, we started with everybody who can work from home, please do. Or in fact, actually, ahead of the curve was, if you'd like to work from home, now's your chance. We're not going to monitor. Previously, we would try to balance people working from home with being in the studio, and working from home seemed to be a little bit of a privilege for some people. So we just quickly got rid of that stigma. It's like, right, if anybody wants to work from home, now's your chance, off you go. And then it became mandated of like, if you can work from home now, please do. And then obviously the last stage was, right, office is shut, you're all working from home.
Yeah, it was the sort of three stages of lockdown, weren't there? It was like, if you wouldn't mind, if you can, and it was, if you can, you reach, and it was, you might be at home. It was like stage 3. Okay, so I think what I'd also like to ask is I think a lot of studios would have felt this. I mean, did you, what level of concern and pressure did you feel? Because presumably you had projects that were underway, that were in flight, with deadlines that you knew you had to hit. And obviously we're suddenly facing what was potentially going to be a pretty big change in terms of the way that you were going to work.
Yeah, I do think in the early stages, the sort of the business need was secondary to the public health crisis. I think that we've all focused a lot on work and projects and stuff, but actually we didn't know at that stage quite how serious this was going to prove. And obviously it's proven to be very serious. But at that point it could have been like really bad. So we were really keen just to focus on making sure everybody was safe. And that was the priority in the beginning, and that we were doing the right thing for the spread of the virus for our social responsibility. So yeah, I think that was the focus in the beginning. And then when you realise that, okay, now we've got everybody away and now we've got these projects to deliver, that's when the creative problem solving hat got worn.
Yeah.
And that is, to some extent, that is what we do as a business. We solve problems like at that sort of high end the work that we create has never been created before. Every project we're creating something new, we're doing something technically challenging or creatively challenging. So this, in some respects, was a similar sort of mindset of, right, okay, this is what the picture looks like, and these are these amazing people that we've got to call on. How do we solve this problem? And you guys were a massive part in that. And we were lucky to be able to call on you from our technical perspective of, there was a lot to sort out in a very short period of time. But at some point, it was also quite exciting at that point. It was a really, sort of thrilling challenge to try to solve really quickly. For, as you say, there are lots of projects live, and in short form, we don't have that luxury of time to solve them. Things were being delivered as we were removing people out of the studio. So it was quite hairy, but it was also, I never once, from one moment, thought that we wouldn't be able to deliver projects or solve the problems that we were going to face. Yeah, it was good.
Okay, cool. Well, let's move on to a little bit about Flame specifically then. I mean, give us an indication or an insight. How pivotal or key is Flame as an application to your business?
Well, it's what we started with. Trust and I, we had 4 people when we started. Trust and I were both Flame artists, and we had Phil, who's on CG, and Chris, who's our producer. So, half of our business already was, 2/3 of our business already was Flame when we started. And that hasn't actually changed. we always try to put the right software with the right artists. So it's all about the people. If we've got great people, we'll just give them the software that they need. But the people that we seem to have been attracting, the artists that we've attracting, have been predominantly Flame artists. So they just like to use Flame for the work that they do. So probably, in fact, I know exactly, 42% of our revenue comes from Flame on average at the moment. So it's almost half of our business. And the margins of the Flame work, the profit margins are higher than the other areas because it takes up studio space and client attendance and the hospitality side of things. That sort of service element is higher with the Flame work. So that's the very sort of high-end offering that we pride ourselves on. So it's absolutely pivotal that we got that bit working well.
Yeah, okay. I'm very impressed you know the precise revenue that it draws. That's that level of business analysis is very impressive. So I'm going to bring in the tech guys now. I mean, and ask them a couple of questions. I mean, we're talking about Flame and having to deliver that as a remote desktop, remote artist experience under the sort of pandemic circumstances. I think Autodesk Flame, generally people would agree, Tim, that this is it's a fairly idiosyncratic application. It has its quirks in terms of installing and managing it. What did you perceive to be the challenges in terms of getting that set up for a remote delivery?
Yes, like you said, Flame is rather specific in the hardware that it prefers to use. In fact, it's only fairly recently that we've had the freedom to choose different hardware other than the officially supported configuration. Yeah. And Flame also drives the graphics card very hard, as you would expect. So I guess the difficulties are that the way that Flame is set up, it's expecting to talk through a very specific number of high-end NVIDIA Quadro graphics cards going to a small number of high-quality video monitors. And it hasn't been very happy if you change any of that. Newer versions of Flame are a bit more relaxed about it, but even so, there's a few fundamental changes that you have to make to the way that Flame sets up the machine. Okay,
and so Lee, with a view to sort of approaching a remote session for Flame or setting up remote artists for Flame, what were the options available from a technology point of view when looking at doing that? What did you consider?
So Flame offers some unique challenges in the fact that you can have high resolution and high frame rates. So in that vein, there's only a couple of options that you can really do. I mean, a lot of people in this scenario have taken machines home, but the smallest amount of data that we can move is the pixels. So at that point, we have a streaming pixel solution. There's two main ones. There's the remote boost from HP, formerly known as RGS, and obviously Teradici. The reason that we ended up going with Teradici was primarily the fact that Coffee and TV had bought a router when they started the business, and the idea was that it was great at pulling stuff in, but not pushing stuff out, as most routers are and most people do for what they want. It's internet access, pulling stuff into the business. So the VPN part of the router would have struggled to do what we wanted it to do. Teradici actually allowed us to bypass that. So that was the fundamental reason why we chose Teradici.
So Teradici meant that wasn't a problem and you were able to work around it?
Yeah, essentially there's a cloud access manager in Teradici that allows us to bypass the VPN. So it makes it even more secure in some respects.
So were there any changes to the underlying infrastructure that were required then, if you were just working around that problem with Teradici?
Yeah, there was, with Teradici, the underlying infrastructure, we had to obviously hit some things for use where we're not impacting on their network as such, so that the 3D guys could use the VPN and we could use Teradici to actually bypass that to allow us more bandwidth into their building from the externals.
Right.
And we also had to build a cloud access connector server, a physical extra server on site, which managed and brokered all of the PCOIP Teradici connections.
Did you do that remotely, Tim, or was that something you went to site physically to do before the full lockdown came into place?
The initial build was done on site, but then all of the rest of the installation and config was all done remotely.
Right. Okay. So we're talking about Teradici. I mean, Tim, could you explain in really simple terms what Teradici fundamentally is as a technology?
Yeah. So as Lee said, the Teradici PCOIP system involves sending pixels, sending the output of a screen or a virtual screen to something at the other end of a network connection, and then also sending keyboard, mouse, tablet inputs back through the connection to the initial machine. So in a way, it's like a what we used to call a KVM extender, a keyboard, video, mouse extender, except much more flexible because it goes over an IP network, which means you can send it around your company over your Ethernet network, or you can send it over the internet.
And what are the sort of the bandwidth requirements in terms of, I guess, the minute you move outside someone's on-premise infrastructure, where you've got possibly a professional grade of bandwidth and internet connectivity, and you're moving to what would currently be somebody's domestic environment. I mean, are there considerations into what level of capability they have at the domestic end from a bandwidth point of view?
I mean, that's actually dictated to by screen resolution. So that was one of the conversations that we had to have with Truss and the boys at Coffee and TV. They've got lovely HDR 4K monitors, which are wonderful when you're using Flame on-prem. But obviously, 4K being pushed over a domestic is kind of a tough ask to do. So depending on resolution depends on bandwidth, to be fair. Most of the guys took home 2K monitors or 2560 by 1600 monitors, which are more than fair game to do over a normal sort of ish connection. The ideal being, normally if we sort of take a 2K monitor like that, we could be looking at anywhere between 30 and 50 megabits per second, dependent on frame rate, dependent on lots of things. It can go higher than that, but most of the domestics and Teradici is very good at handling wide area networks in that vein. So it's just bearable within, a normal domestic connection.
Right. And with Teradici, I think there's more than one way we can deploy that. I mean, there is a hardware and a software option with Teradici. I mean, what were the considerations specifically for Coffee and TV that would guide us one way or the other in terms of whether it was going to be a hardware or a software deployment?
It was actually the VPN that was the real kicker, because the 3D guys were actually moving data in and out through the VPN, which was perfectly secure and happy. But obviously, to stream pixels at the same time as the guys are transferring data, their experience would have been very poor using the remote workstation cards, which still requires a VPN. That was the choice when we suddenly decided that actually there was also quite a delay on getting Teradici remote workstation cards. So that was another reason for sort of backing a multiple horses at once. We sort of had the software solution in our back pocket because we could actually do that remotely. So essentially, the decision was made for us by the fact that we needed to get as much throughput as we could in and out of Coffee and TV.
Yeah, and as you say, there are kind of extended lead times at the moment with supplying any physical hardware to studios. Depending on what you're ordering, it can be a lesser impact, but most things seem to have slowed down a little bit, particularly actually with remote working, because it's suddenly a technology that everybody needs. Rather than people using it through choice, which was the situation before, of course. So the next thing I wanted to ask really was, Derek, the question for you. You mentioned when we first started this conversation that obviously Flame has a kind of client attend component. That's part of the reason that you choose to use Flame in your sessions, is that a client can sit and work live with an artist and get kind of dynamic real-time results. I mean, did you have any particular concerns about that part of the workflow if you were moving to a remote delivery, because obviously you're not going to be able to put a customer in the same room as an artist currently?
No, you're right, we can't. And that is an element of, it's one of our USPs that our artists are very very user friendly. So we like to get them in front of clients and sort of build that trust and that energy to work together. And that is harder remotely. But at the same time, there's a lot of tech out there that improves that situation. So clients aren't feeling totally isolated, I don't think, from us. We're using just screen sharing on Zoom, and any of the collaborative apps works quite nicely. We've got Clearview Flex, I think it's called, from SohoNet, which is a way that the artist can see the Flame UI in real time. So it feels like you're sitting next to the Flame artist watching what they do on the machine itself, which is really cool. And actually, there's a sort of because they're not sitting with you all day. When they are with you, they're focused on you, and you actually feels like we're getting a bit more quality time out of your clients rather than just hanging out in a nice studio in Soho. So it feels more intentional, and for all the downsides, there's as many upsides, I think.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of what we're finding in this current restricted way of working. There are benefits as well as downsides. So, what in terms of us Escape working with you on the remote frame? I mean, what did you deem to be a successful outcome? I mean, how did you measure that?
Well, we had, I think, at the point of deciding that we needed to evacuate, we had 9 flames running in the studio. But we could obviously see a tail off coming as shoots were getting closed down and live action stuff was stopping. Mm-hmm. So we were aiming for 6 or 7 flames to be set up remotely would be success. And that's certainly where we're at now. So thanks for that. We were always confident with our TeamViewer 3D CGI VPN type remote working solution because that's tried and tested, and we've been doing that for a while. So we weren't so concerned about that. But having heard some of the horror stories from some of our competitors where once the Flame guys get on the VPN the same time as the CG guys are on the VPN and the whole thing just grinds to a halt, what I hadn't realized was that might be an issue. So success in retrospect is also the fact that our Flame guys and our CG guys can actually work happily at the same time as each other.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, Lee, could you pick up on that slightly? I mean, I was going to come to that because obviously Coffee and TV have what I would describe or we might describe as a standard VFX CG artist running perhaps Maya or Nuke on a less intense workstation or less greedy workstation in terms of bandwidth consumption. What are the technical the technical elements that are allowing us to kind of harness the Flame workstations along with those other VFX guys and not destroy all of the bandwidth and capability?
It's essentially as we've discussed. I mean, the big thing for Coffee and TV was get the guys out as quick as they can, and I think you can actively rely on 3D guys being a little bit more geeky and not requiring big Flame hardware. So they've generally got machines at home, and they've generally got software that they can work with at home. It's not always the case, but a lot of the time. And in the case of these guys, they've been working that way for some time. So the VPN route was fairly straightforward for them to absolutely just dial in from home, pick up the scene files and things that they needed for Maya, Nuke, and whatever, and just do some general CG work. That wasn't a problem. The problem was obviously the VPN. It essentially gets to a point where if all you're doing is transferring data up and down it, there's no bandwidth, so someone has to lose. If we did the Flame down the VPN as well, then the experience that the Flame artists would have been absolutely abysmal, and they wouldn't have been able to successfully run Flame as they were. And alternatively, the download times for the guys in CG land would have reached astronomically high levels. By separating the two out and using the Cloud Access Manager, as Tim mentioned, that we installed, that allows us to essentially just send pixels out. So nothing leaves Coffee and TV data-wise through that route. And, we're already in discussions with Truss and the guys there about post-virus, what the plans are going forward. And the ideal would be to obviously put all of the CG guys on the same mechanism as the Flame, because then essentially all the data is secure and left at Coffee and TV. Plus, we're not restricted in any way by a piece of hardware that's trying to protect anything. So primarily it was the divide and conquer that really saved us.
Right. Okay. And just to delve into some real technical nitty-gritty. I mean, we mentioned before that Flame is a slightly precious application in terms of needing to run on a very, very specific system requirement. I know that there are issues or challenges with getting sort of Teradici performance to run well with Wacoms and pen and tablet performance. I mean, could you speak a little bit about the real particular challenges around that, and perhaps some of the challenges with bit depth and audio and some of that real detail?
We've been doing remote flames and flames for some time now, and obviously there's lots of issues where things such as RGS, which is a wonderful streaming product, which was the alternative, but it does have issues with only being able to do 44 kilohertz audio, whereas most broadcast audio is always 48 kilohertz. So therein lies, a massive obstacle to begin with. Now, Teradici does support 48, so there's another aspect for it. Wacoms in Flame and Linux, Wacoms in Linux period have been the bane of a lot of people's life for a long time. And Flame just adds to that woe even more with, dependent on drivers and stuff. It's got a lot better in recent years, and the recent versions have been aren't too bad to get working, but anybody that's tried to get a Wacom working remotely on either solution will feel that pain. And there are idiosyncrasies about which version of hardware, which version, whether you're using the remote workstation card, and if you are, what firmware is on it. The Wacom itself causes a lot of issues, and what type of Wacom it is. The older Wacoms now just aren't supported, so anything that's not HID compliant, USB, that can cause hell. But yeah, it's been one of those things that if everything's the right version and the right format and right everything, it all joins up and works really nicely. Good.
Well, it sounds like it's all moved on a little bit. I mean, I know that we've certainly spoken to studios previously where Wacom performance can be a difficult issue. Tim, have you got anything to add to that? I mean, I know that you spend a lot of time actually deploying these systems. I mean, when you're not getting good performance immediately once something's been configured, where do you start to hunt for troubleshooting, and where do you look in the stack to sort of diagnose problems if you come across them?
Well, I guess with Wacom tablets specifically, it does tend to depend on, as Lee says, which firmware you're running on the Teradici side, and which Wacom driver you're running, and sometimes which version of the tablet. They do work if everything lines up, and it's certainly much easier now than it has been in the past. It feels to me like over the past couple of months even, everybody's kind of released new versions of software and new hardware revisions which have fixed most of these earlier problems.
One other question about that perhaps is, we know that there are lots of legacy Flame systems out there. I mean, Flame is not a cheap solution to invest in and maintain, and you've got the software, and then obviously a new version of that appears every year, but you have there were 3 supported hardware configs for the workstation on the HP Z8 platform, but I think now 2, since I think the Z820 option is going end of life. But I mean, is there a preference in terms of what we would want somebody to be running today? I mean, do we look for the latest and best spec that we can possibly access?
I would say that yes, particularly newer versions of the Flame software. So either Flame 2020.3.1 or the newly released Flame 2021, they are much better set up for this kind of slightly non-standard work, as in working remotely rather than connected directly to a monitor. With older versions of the hardware, I suppose if you have a host card, a remote workstation card in the machine, then it doesn't make so much of a difference. Though you might have problems if you're still running, if you're running an older Flame that's still running the older CentOS version 7.2, then you may have some driver conflicts.
But with the newer version of the software, you'd really much rather be running on a later spec machine.
Yes, either CentOS 7.4 or again the newly released CentOS 7.6 Autodesk version, which does include newer versions of audio drivers, newer versions of Wacom drivers, and will play much more nicely with Teradici PCIe hardware.
Thank you for that. So
I think you mentioned, Jason, about bit depth, and
I did. Yes, I did ask you that. Yeah.
So yeah, bit depth is an issue. All of the remote streaming pixel protocols are 8-bit. So obviously, as I was saying about Coffee and TV, Derek and the boys have 4K HDR type monitors, which are wonderful and can display all the colors in all the glory. The problem with Teradici is that it is an 8-bit format. So, it will do true color and it's 16.7 million, but it won't give you that extended range that you might like if you were actually on-prem. So if you were doing HDR type workflow, or if you're doing color grading critical workflows, then obviously that's an issue. I mean, it's without a doubt, it's good enough to do sort of match grade type workflows. That's not a problem. But if you want to see it in all its glory, I think it's sort of, that's where the client attends, sit in a room with a lovely big monitor and all the good stuff still needs to happen on-prem at that point.
Okay, and I mean, other Coffee and TV artists, are they working with a dual monitor setup at home, or are they working with a single monitor?
At the minute, it's just a single 2560 by 1600, the 2K monitor, and that's more, down to bandwidth limitations, to be honest.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Derek. So, what it's quite a positive story in lots of respects. Really, this process that you've been through, finding the positives in a difficult situation. I mean, what does you mentioned at the outset that there was this appetite to have a small or a remote deployment in the early days, and that sort of come back full circle. I mean, how do you see it all? I mean, when the lockdown or the restrictions start to ease up or are restricted, I mean, do you think that you're just going to go back to working as you did before, or do you think there'll be a legacy or some learnings from this period that you'll carry forward into what you go on to do?
Well, there's a few big questions there.
Sorry, yeah, it was a bit expansive. You could break off whichever piece of that sounds like you can answer it.
Okay, I'll try and do it chronologically. Obviously, it's really hard I wish I had a crystal ball and could foresee the future. It feels like the social distancing measures, as lockdown gets eased, I don't think it's going to be straight back to how we were before. So we're very keen to be ahead of that curve, and we're already looking at ways that we can use our 2 separated floors with visitor books and contact tracing, and making sure that we have and split shifts and deep cleans on Friday nights. And there's a whole sort of process involved that we're now planning for when we can get back into the studio, what that looks like. So that's sort of stage 1. Stage 2 is, what does the world look like from a business perspective? How much work is there? How many competitors will still be around? And how do we optimize, really, is the question. I think the one thing I've learned from running this business is that in every difficulty there is an opportunity. And we're in a very relatively robust position, I think, in terms of being able to keep ticking over as we've been talking. We certainly don't anticipate needing any extra Soho floor space, which is what we were thinking about 4 weeks ago. We were just working out whether we should expand and where we should expand to and in what areas and the rest of it. So I think physically we don't need more space anymore, which is a great cost saving in terms of the business planning. If there's not as much work around and we need to shrink, then that's still okay. We've got 2 floors, so we can probably retrench back into 1 and use now we've got a virtual studio all around the country with artists everywhere, in fact all over the world, that can all connect successfully. We've got artists at the moment in Sweden and Finland, and everyone connecting into our studio and working successfully with us. So we're certainly fighting. We're bigger than our physical footprint. Always have been bigger than our physical footprint. But this has definitely pushed that remote working mentality forward a couple of years, I think. We'll certainly be looking to optimize cloud rendering and workstations and that whole, that leap into the cloud. Surely that's going to happen much earlier than it was otherwise would have done.
Yeah, and I suppose that's interesting. I guess the Soho property cost has been a problem for creative studios for quite some time. I mean, as we found with other studios that we speak to, the increasing cost of rental property leases in the West End, has squeezed people out, and we've seen quite large migrations north of Oxford Street and over to the City and Old Street and various places. I mean, to some extent, a situation, I suppose it's true to say that a situation like this has sort of, in some ways, forced you to kind of solve that problem in another way, in terms of your comment about not needing further space.
Yeah, you're right. And more than that, it actually made us, because of the technical setup that we've got now, where we are, our cloud, like our technical, compute cloud, is in a Soho studio. It's secure and it's working well, but does it need to be in a Soho studio? I would have thought not. It might be better fit for purpose if it's in a dedicated server room in Swindon somewhere with 24-hour security and air conditioning, like all of the jazz that a proper infrastructure server room would have. So it feels like moving that kit out of, just using the studio space for what it's designed for, which is clients and presentations. I think that we'll be using it much more in that style moving forward, rather than just having to be there because that's where all of our stuff is.
Yeah, okay, that is interesting. So it starts to sort of shrink down the need for the size of the physical footprint in central London, doesn't it? And have a lot of the technology dispersed in other locations. And in effect, you've had you've kind of proved that point with the way you've managed to work under the pandemic. I think we're probably just about going to wrap things up here, guys. But just over to Tim and Lee. In terms of a wish list, with respect to the work we've done with the remote flames at Coffee and TV, I mean, are there features within the technology stack that you're using that are missing or that you'd like to see? I mean, if you were to have your crystal ball and say, well, look, if we had to do this again next year for somebody, or in 6 months' time, we'd really like that to be available, or we'd really like this to be available in the existing technology products you're using, or indeed even a technology product that doesn't exist yet. I mean, do you have a view on that?
For me, it's the 10-bit support in the protocol, and I know that there's lots of people all working on that as we speak, because once we have gradable machines at home, then the biggest issue is SDI, obviously. It would be lovely to run remote flames everywhere, but SDI as a format is very old, very outdated. It's brilliant, without a doubt, but there are newer techniques that could offer us the same thing. So at some point, we will want to run Flame remotely, but with a reasonable HDR output that people could grade with or look at color correct workflows. And that's going to be dependent on a 10-bit format being available that would allow us to do that type of workflow. So RGS, Remote Boost now, or whether it's Teradici or AN, a new one, if a streaming protocol, pixel protocol provider comes along and offers 10-bit with 48 kilohertz and maybe even Dolby, type sound quality that people could actually stream to their homes, then that's going to make a whole different experience become available. That makes fully remote working available. At the minute, you're still going to have to go into the office to do certain parts of the process. We've shown and proven in this crisis that essentially 95% of the workflow can be achieved at home. It's just that last 5% of finesse that you can only get from good quality hardware, good quality everything else, and that's predisposed that also monitors are going to get cheaper but be able to do much higher quality color, maybe even using your TV at home, that type of workflow. So there are ways and stuff there that are still missing from it. Audio is still the bane of our lives, and we're still trying to make sure that audio plays ball across everything that we do, because it's always treated as sort of like second citizen, and it's just as important. But yeah, I think the protocol needs that 10-bit boost. Ideally 12, but 10 will do at the minute. And because bandwidth is such a restrictive thing, and obviously this is highlighting the whole, government's approach to rollout of high-speed internet again. So the more internet that we can get to everybody, the more that we will be able to do this type of workflow from home. So, and it focuses, I think, at the minute, normally people buy internet for home for TV, phone, and a little bit of internet. I think, the more that we do it, people might look at cheap business grade connections if they are planning to work from home a lot, so there are, lots of pieces of the puzzle that will change, but it will change how we approach it.
Yeah, there's always somebody making a lot of money in a crisis, isn't there? And potentially the network companies are going to benefit here, in that bandwidth becomes even more of an essential utility than it already was, I guess. Tim, just to finish off with you on the tech side, I mean, is there anything particularly that would make your life easier when you're thinking about configuring systems and workstations? I mean, is there anything in the technology that you wish was there that isn't currently?
What would be nice would be if everybody had faster internet connections, honestly. So all power to the network companies then. Spend more money on bandwidth. I mean, just as a comparison, I guess, a typical home broadband connection, the sort of BT Infinity grade one, I think the standard is about 35 megabits, and the higher speed one is about 75 megabits, with a Virgin cable connection being a lot higher, anything up to 100 or 200 megabits. And yes, as Lee said, you want to allow maybe 50 megabits for a 2K size screen, which is okay if it's just one person, but if you are working from home with a family who also want to use your internet connection, you're going to start having to fight each other for bandwidth.
Indeed, yes, I've experienced that very same problem myself today, given that I'm working from home and have children trying to homeschool across the internet. So everybody's using every last drop of connectivity that we have, and performance has been largely okay, but this has been the day when I've noticed it. But I mean, Derek, do you think that it changes, again, the last question to you perhaps, does this change the way Coffee and TV and you guys think about bandwidth as a resource? Is it something that you now think about differently in terms of it being an essential utility, perhaps the way you thought about it before?
Yes, of course. I think this has made a lot of people think about lots of things differently. Things we took for granted before, we didn't realise quite how essential they were. We had actually already commissioned a 10 gig line to be put into the studio, and was hoping that we'd be able to use this time to be digging up pavements and accessing that. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen until we get back into the studio. But having a sort of fail-safe line, so we're going to keep the existing 1 gig connection and then have a 10 gig connection alongside it as a fallback, because obviously it's just as essential now as electricity. We can't run a company without fast internet, so like we can't run it without electricity. So so it's absolutely essential. I'm sure the pressure from and the realization of the general public, at times like this, will make change happen more quickly. So I would have thought in a couple of years' time we'll be looking back on a differently connected country, I'd like to think.
I think you could well be right. Well, I think that about wraps it up from us. I'd like to thank all of our participants. So thank you very much, Derek. Thank you for contributing your time to this discussion. Greatly appreciated. That's all we've got time for. I'd like to thank Derek, Lee and Tim for contributing this afternoon. Really appreciated. In particular, thank you to Derek for taking time out from what I'm sure is a busy schedule to have that discussion with us. Please like and subscribe, and you will find links to all of the technology we've been discussing this afternoon on our website, should you wish to explore further interests. Thank you very much.